A stormy night, a pregnant woman thrown from her mansion, bruised and bleeding. But when a military helicopter cuts through the darkness and a man steps out, her nightmare is just beginning because the person who promised to save her was paid $500,000 to kill her. This is the true story of Grace Sullivan, a woman who discovered her husband's plan to murder her for $12 million. What she did next will leave you speechless. If you love stories of survival, justice, and women who refuse to stay silent, you're in the right place. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe so you never miss a story that matters. Now let's begin where it all started to unravel. The flash of cameras felt like lightning strikes against Grace Sullivan's face. She stood on the limestone steps of the Travis County Courthouse, one hand pressed protectively over her swollen belly, the other gripping the microphone stand. 8 months pregnant, wearing a simple navy dress that did nothing to hide the bruises yellowing along her collarbone. She looked directly into the lens of the Cake Sand news camera. Behind her, the Texas sun beat down mercilessly, turning the June afternoon into something thick and oppressive. Sweat beaded at her temples, but Grace didn't move to wipe it away. She'd learned months ago that any sign of weakness could be used against her. Even now, even after everything, she kept her spine straight and her voice steady. "My name is Grace Sullivan," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "3 days ago, my husband tried to have me killed for $12 million. The crowd of reporters erupted into a cacophony of shouted questions. Microphones thrust forward like weapons. Camera operators jostled for better angles. The noise was overwhelming, a wall of sound that threatened to drown out her courage. Grace's fingers tightened on the microphone stand until her knuckles went white. Behind her, attorney Rachel Hoffman placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. The prosecutor's tailored gray suit and steel-rimmed glasses gave her the appearance of someone who'd fought these battles before and won. Rachel squeezed once. A silent reminder, you're not alone anymore. Grace drew in a deep breath and continued, her voice cutting through the chaos. For 18 months, Derek Sullivan abused me. He isolated me from my friends, my family, anyone who might have helped. He controlled every dollar I spent, every friend I saw, every moment of my day. He tracked my phone. He monitored my movements. He made me believe I was crazy for being afraid. A woman in the front row, a reporter Grace recognized from Channel 7, had tears in her eyes. Grace met her gaze and kept talking. And when I got pregnant, when I thought things might change, when I dared to hope that becoming a father would soften him, he started planning my murder. The word hung in the air like smoke. Murder. Not abuse, not neglect. Murder. Premeditated and calculated. A male reporter from Channel 4 pushed forward, his expression skeptical in that way Grace had come to recognize. The look that said she was probably exaggerating, probably emotional, probably looking for attention or money or revenge. "Mrs. Sullivan, these are serious allegations. Do you have proof?" Grace's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. She'd been waiting for this question, had practiced her answer 100 times in the mirror of Rachel's office, making sure her voice wouldn't crack, making sure she sounded credible instead of hysterical. "I have a recording of him discussing it with his mistress how to make my death look like childbirth complications. I have bank records showing payments to the man he hired to kill me, a former Army colonel who pretended to rescue me only to throw me out of a helicopter over Lady Bird Lake. I have medical documentation of every injury he caused. Every bruise he swore was an accident. Every broken bone he blamed on my clumsiness." She paused, letting the details sink in. Around her, the crowd had gone quiet. Even the skeptical reporter had lowered his microphone. "And yesterday," Grace continued, her voice stronger now, "a Travis County jury found him guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, domestic violence, fraud, racketeering. Derek Sullivan will spend the next 45 years in prison, and every woman he might have hurt after me will be safe." The cameras went wild. Flashbulbs exploded like fireworks. Questions came from every direction, overlapping and urgent. "How did you survive? What about the baby? Are you afraid he'll appeal? What do you want other women to know?" Rachel stepped forward smoothly, her professional demeanor a shield. "Mrs. Sullivan will not be taking individual questions at this time. However, she wants every woman watching to understand that domestic violence is not a private matter. It's a crime. And there are people who will fight for you if you find the courage to speak up. Grace stepped back, her knees suddenly weak. The adrenaline that had carried her through the press conference began to ebb, leaving behind exhaustion and something that felt almost like grief. This was supposed to feel like victory. This was supposed to be the moment where everything made sense, where all the pain had purpose. Instead, she felt hollow, empty, like she'd climbed a mountain only to discover there was nothing at the summit but more mountains ahead. Because Derek was in prison? Yes, but she still jumped at loud noises, still checked over her shoulder in parking lots, still woke up at 3 a.m. in a cold sweat, convinced she heard his footsteps in the hallway. Victory didn't erase trauma. It just gave you the space to start healing. Rachel's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "You did good," she murmured. "Come on, let's get you out of here." They walked toward the waiting car, security guards forming a protective barrier against the press. Grace moved carefully, one hand on her belly where the baby kicked and rolled, oblivious to the chaos of the world she was about to enter. But that wasn't the story Grace needed to tell right now. The story they needed to hear, the one that would help other women trapped in similar nightmares, started 72 hours ago. It started in the moment she realized the man flying the rescue helicopter wasn't there to save her at all. No, it started even before that. It started with an anniversary dinner and a smashed phone and the slow, dawning horror of understanding that the person you married, the person you trusted with your whole heart, was planning your funeral while you slept beside him. It started with the moment Grace Sullivan stopped being a victim and decided to become a survivor. 72 hours earlier, Grace sat alone at a corner table in Perry's Steakhouse, watching the ice melt in her water glass. The restaurant hummed with the quiet conversations of Austin's wealthy elite, the kind of people who thought $400 for dinner was reasonable. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over white tablecloths and polished silverware. Around her, couples leaned toward each other, laughing, touching hands across tables. Grace watched them with something that felt like mourning for a life she'd never really had. She checked her phone again. Derek was 2 hours late. The waiter had already stopped by 3 times, his professional smile growing increasingly strained. Grace could see the pity in his eyes, the way he glanced at her wedding ring and then at the empty chair across from her. She'd become that woman, the one everyone felt sorry for, the one left waiting while her husband did more important things. Her phone buzzed suddenly, not a call, a text. "Stop checking the time. Makes it you look desperate. Be there in 20. Grace set the phone down carefully, fighting the urge to throw it across the room. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the table, willing them to be still. 20 minutes meant 40. 40 meant an hour. She knew this dance by heart, had performed it at dozens of restaurants, business dinners, anniversary celebrations that weren't really celebrations at all. The elderly couple at the next table was celebrating something. The woman wore pearls and a soft smile, and her husband kept refilling her wine glass, his hand lingering on hers. They must have been married 50 years, maybe more. Grace wondered if the woman had ever sat alone, waiting, making excuses to waiters about traffic or important phone calls. She wondered if anyone ever really got the fairy tale. When Derek finally arrived, he didn't apologize. He slid into his seat, straightened his Rolex, and immediately flagged down their waiter. "We'll both have the bone-in ribeye, medium rare. She'll have water. I'll take the Macallan. Neat?" Grace's stomach turned. She'd been craving salmon all week, had looked forward to ordering the grilled Atlantic salmon with roasted vegetables. But Derek had this way of making decisions for her, as if her preferences were inconveniences he couldn't be bothered to consider. "Actually, yes, I'd like the salmon," Grace said quietly, hating how small her voice sounded. Derek's smile didn't reach his eyes. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a warning sign Grace had learned to read like a weather forecast predicting storms. "Honey, you know red meat is better for the baby. All that iron and protein. Trust me on this." The waiter shifted uncomfortably, his pen hovering over his notepad. He looked at Grace, waiting for her to insist, to exercise the basic human right of choosing her own dinner. But Grace could feel Derek's eyes on her, could sense the calculation happening behind his pleasant expression. If she pushed back now, he'd be charming and accommodating in front of the waiter. Then, in the car, in private. She'd pay for embarrassing him. Grace forced herself to smile. The ribeye is fine. After the waiter left, Derek leaned forward. His cologne was expensive, overwhelming, the kind that announced itself before he entered a room. We're meeting the investors from Dallas tomorrow morning. 8 a.m. sharp at the office. I need you to wear the blue dress, the one with the high neck. And for God's sake, do something with your hair. You look like you just rolled out of bed. Grace's hand instinctively went to her hair, which she'd spent an hour styling that morning. She'd blown it out carefully, curled the ends, even watched a YouTube tutorial on how to make it look effortless and elegant. I thought this looked nice. Well, you thought wrong. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails while they sat in silence. The light from the screen reflected off his face, making him look alien and distant. These investors are worth $30 million. Grace, $30 million. I can't have you showing up looking like a suburban housewife. You need to remember who you married. Image matters in my business. Our business, Grace thought but didn't say. She'd helped him build Sullivan Development from the ground up, had worked as his bookkeeper and assistant and silent partner for the first 3 years of their marriage, before he'd convinced her to quit, before he'd made her financially dependent on him. Grace stared at her belly, at the curve of life growing inside her. She'd thought the pregnancy might soften him, might remind him of the man he'd been when they first met, the man who sent flowers to the hospital where she worked as a nurse, the man who called her beautiful without adding corrections. Instead, it seemed to sharpen his edges, give him new weapons. He knew she couldn't easily run now, knew she was vulnerable in ways she'd never been before. Her own phone buzzed again. She glanced at it. 14 text messages. All from Derek, all sent over the past 2 hours, each one tracking her location, demanding updates, asking why she'd moved from the table to the restroom earlier. How long had she been gone? Who had she talked to? Why wasn't she responding faster? You really need to stop being so clingy, Derek said without looking up from his screen. Constantly checking your phone makes you look desperate. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so crushing. Grace said nothing, just tucked her phone away and folded her hands over her belly, feeling the baby move beneath her palms. A small flutter, like a butterfly trapped inside her. Dinner arrived. Grace pushed her steak around her plate. Her appetite gone. The meat was perfect, cooked exactly as Derek had ordered, but it tasted like ash in her mouth. She forced herself to eat a few bites, knowing he'd comment if she didn't, knowing he'd accuse her of being wasteful or ungrateful or difficult. Derek ate quickly, efficiently, checking his watch every few minutes. When the bill came, he handed over his black Amex card without looking at the total. $378 for a meal Grace hadn't wanted, at a restaurant she hadn't chosen, celebrating an anniversary that felt more like a funeral. In the parking garage, Grace made the mistake of suggesting they take separate cars home. She had a doctor's appointment early the next morning, 7 a.m., and didn't want to wake him. Derek's expression changed instantly. The charming businessman vanished, replaced by something cold and dangerous. Get in the car, Grace. Derek, I just thought, get in the car. She got in. He drove too fast. Weaving through traffic on I-35, his jaw clenched. Grace kept her eyes forward, her hands protectively over her stomach. She'd learned not to speak when he was like this. Words only made it worse, gave him ammunition, provided targets for his rage. At a red light near 6th Street, Grace's hand moved instinctively to her phone. Maybe she could text her old friend Sarah, ask if she could crash there tonight. Just until Derek calmed down. Just until the storm passed. Derek saw the movement. His hand shot out, grabbing her phone before she could unlock it. Who are you texting? No one. I wasn't. He threw the phone against the windshield. The screen spider-webbed, pieces of glass falling into her lap like sharp rain. Grace flinched, tears burning her eyes, her hand automatically covering her belly to protect the baby from the flying debris. A car honked behind them. The light had turned green. Derek looked in the rearview mirror, and his entire demeanor shifted like a switch being flipped. He rolled down his window, all smiles and charm. Sorry, buddy. Just a little disagreement with the wife. You know how it is? The other driver waved him off, grinning. Just another couple having the spat. Nothing to see here. Boys will be boys. Marriage is hard. All the dismissive phrases that let men like Derek hide in plain sight. Derek rolled up the window and drove home in silence. Grace stared at her broken phone in her lap, at the shattered glass reflecting the passing streetlights. Each shard caught the light differently, creating tiny prismatic rainbows that mocked her with their beauty. That was when she realized something with perfect, terrible clarity. No one was going to believe her. No one was going to help her. Derek was too charming, too successful, too good at playing the role of devoted husband in public. And she was just another emotional pregnant woman, probably hormonal, probably overreacting, probably making mountains out of molehills. She was going to have to save herself. The next morning, Grace woke to an empty bed. Derek had already left for his early golf meeting, leaving behind the faint smell of his cologne and a note on the kitchen counter. Get a new phone today. Make sure you install the tracking app like before. Grace crumpled the note, her hand shaking. The tracking app. Find My, he called it, though they both knew it was so he could monitor her every movement. She'd deleted it once, 2 months ago. That night, he'd locked her in the bedroom for 6 hours, demanding to know where she'd been, who she'd seen, why she was trying to hide things from him. She made coffee with trembling hands, staring out the kitchen window at their perfectly manicured lawn in the Westlake Hills neighborhood. Every house on this street cost over $2 million. Every neighbor thought they were the perfect couple. The doorbell rang at 9:15. Grace answered cautiously, peering through the peephole first. A FedEx driver stood on the porch, holding a small package. She opened the door a crack. Delivery for Derek Sullivan, the driver said cheerfully, scanning the label. I can sign for it. The driver handed her the electronic pad. Grace scrawled something approximating her signature and took the package. It was small, flat, about the size of a jewelry box. No return address. She should have just set it on Derek's desk in his home office. Should have left it alone. But something made her pause. Maybe it was the lack of a return address. Maybe it was the way her hands had stopped shaking for the first time since last night. Grace opened the package. Inside was a hotel key card and a handwritten note on expensive stationery. The handwriting was feminine, looping and confident. Suite 4700, Saturday 8 p.m. Don't be late this time. T. Grace's breath caught in her throat. T. Tessa. It had to be Tessa Monroe, Derek's business associate, the woman he'd hired 6 months ago as his executive assistant, the woman who was always at his side during business dinners, whose laugh Grace heard in the background of his late-night phone calls. She should have been surprised. She should have been heartbroken. Instead, she felt something else, entirely opportunity. Grace looked at the key card, at the note, at the FedEx label showing it had been sent from a downtown location. Tessa had been careless, or maybe arrogant. Either way, she'd just handed Grace the first real weapon she'd had in months. But she needed proof, not just suspicions or circumstantial evidence. She needed Derek's voice, Tessa's voice, something concrete. Grace walked to the nursery she'd been slowly decorating, the room that should have been filled with hope instead of dread. On the changing table sat the baby monitor she'd bought last week, state-of-the-art, with video and audio recording capabilities. It connected to an app on her phone and stored everything in the cloud. Well, it would connect to her phone. Once she got a new one, Grace grabbed her purse and headed to the Apple store. 2 hours later, she sat in her car in the Barton Creek Square Mall parking lot, setting up her new iPhone. She used her old nursing school email address, the one Derek didn't know about, to create a new Apple ID. Then she downloaded the baby monitor app and synced it. The app had a clever feature. If you placed the monitor in listening mode, it would record any sound in the room and send it directly to the cloud. You could even set it to activate remotely. Grace tested it, speaking into the monitor. Her voice came through, clear as crystal, on her phone. Perfect. Now she just needed to get the monitor into Suite 4700 before Saturday at 8 p.m. She pulled up Google Maps, looking at the address on the keycard envelope. The Four Seasons Hotel, downtown Austin. She'd been there before, for one of Derek's company events. The hotel had terrible security. People walked in and out of the elevator banks all day without anyone checking room keys. Grace made a plan. Saturday afternoon, she'd tell Derek she needed to visit her friend Sarah. He'd hate it, But he'd allow it because refusing would make him look controlling to their therapist. What he didn't know was that Sarah lived 2 blocks from the Four Seasons. She'd have a 3-hour window. That would be enough. Grace pulled out of the parking lot, feeling something she hadn't felt in months, a sense of control. Small, fragile. But there also, she didn't notice the AirTag tucked into the lining of her purse, the one Derek had hidden there weeks ago. Didn't see him watching her location on his own phone from the country club, noting every stop, every movement. Derek Sullivan was always watching, but for the first time, so was Grace. Saturday arrived with the kind of perfect Austin weather that belonged on postcards. Grace wore jeans and a loose sweater, deliberately casual, deliberately forgettable. She told Derek she was meeting Sarah for lunch and maybe some light shopping. "Be back by 5, Derek said, not looking up from his laptop. "We have dinner with the Hendersons at 6:30. "Of course." He grabbed her wrist as she passed, not hard enough to bruise, but firm enough to remind her. "Install the tracking app first. Show me." Grace pulled out her phone with her free hand, opened the Find My app, and showed him the screen. His contact was already added. Location sharing enabled. He'd insisted on watching her set it up that morning. Derek smiled and released her wrist. "Good girl. Have fun." Grace drove to Sarah's apartment in South Congress, the baby monitor tucked carefully in her bag. Sarah met her at the door, took one look at Grace's face, and pulled her into a hug. "How bad is it?" Sarah asked. "Bad," Grace whispered. "But I'm handling it." "Grace, you need to leave him. Today. Right now. We can call the police. I need proof first. Otherwise, it's just my word against his. And you know how that goes." Sarah wanted to argue, but she'd seen too many of her own friends trapped in similar situations. Women who called the police only to have their abusers charm the officers, who filed restraining orders that did nothing, who ended up dead in their own homes while the system failed them. "What do you need me to do?" Sarah asked. "Just be here. If anyone asks, I've been with you all afternoon." Grace left her car parked at Sarah's building and walked the 2 blocks to the Four Seasons. The hotel lobby buzzed with weekend tourists and business travelers. No one gave her a second glance as she headed for the elevators. Suite 4700 was on the top floor. Grace walked down the carpeted hallway, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might wake the baby. At the door, she used the key card. It clicked green. The suite was empty. Expensive. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Lady Bird Lake, and the furniture probably cost more than most people's cars. Grace worked quickly. She placed the baby monitor on the bookshelf, angling it toward the sitting area where people would naturally gather. Then she activated it remotely from her phone, set it to voice-activated recording, and slipped out of the suite. The whole thing took 4 minutes. Back at Sarah's apartment, Grace waited. Sarah made tea, neither of them drank. At 7:45, Grace opened the app on her phone and enabled live listening. At 7:58, she heard a door open. "I thought you weren't coming," Tessa's voice, slightly annoyed. "Had to shake the wife." Derek, sounding relaxed in a way he never did at home. "She's at her friend's place. Bought myself a few hours." The sound of ice clinking in glasses. Footsteps. Then the creak of a couch as someone sat down. "We need to talk about the timeline," Tessa said. "You said this would be handled by now. These things take time. Trust me, I've thought through every angle." "Mama, Derek, and I'm not trying to be a bitch, but I'm not getting any younger. You promised me, and I'll deliver. Once the baby's born, everything changes." Grace's hand flew to her mouth. Sarah gripped her other hand, both of them listening in frozen horror. Derek continued. "Grace's father set up the trust fund specifically for her. 12 million, locked tight. I tried to access it when we got married, but the old bastard was smarter than I thought. The money transfers to Grace only after the baby's born. Something about ensuring his grandchild's security. So once the baby's here, she gets the money." "Right. But here's the thing, Grace has a complicated medical history. High blood pressure, anxiety, history of panic attacks. Her OB has already flagged her file as high risk. Complications happen. Women die in childbirth. Tragic, but not unheard of." The silence stretched out. Grace felt Sarah's nails digging into her hand. "You're talking about killing her." Tessa's voice was quiet. "I'm talking about an unfortunate accident. Her death would be investigated. Sure, Ben. But if the medical records show a pattern of risk factors, if her behavior in the weeks leading up suggests instability, if there's documentation of her refusing to follow medical advice, well, sometimes these things happen. And then as her grieving widower, I inherit everything. The trust, the house, her father's portfolio, 12 million to start. But with smart investments, we're talking about building something real. You and me, Tessa, no more sneaking around. What about the baby? Derek's laugh was cold. What about it? If it survives, great. I'll be the devoted single father, fighting through my grief. If it doesn't, well, that makes things even cleaner. Grace doubled over, a sob catching in her throat. Sarah grabbed the phone, her own hands shaking, and made sure the recording was still running. It was every word, time-stamped and saved to the cloud. Tessa spoke again. When she's due in 4 weeks, I've already talked to her doctor about inducing labor if she goes overdue. Perfectly routine. We'll go to the hospital. And then, sometimes complications spiral fast. Hemorrhaging, embolism, stroke. By the time they realize what's happening, it'll be too late. And I'll be right there, the loving husband, begging them to save her. Jesus. Derek. Cold feet. No, I didn't think you'd actually... What? You thought we'd just wait for her to conveniently die on her own, Tessa? If we want this life, we have to take it. Grace is a sweet girl, but she's weak. She's always been weak. This is natural selection. Business version. More silence. Then Tessa, okay, I'm in. What do you need from me? Just keep playing the supportive assistant. In a few weeks, you'll be a widow's comfort. In a few months, once the dust settles, we'll make it official. Derek and Tessa Sullivan has a nice ring to it. They kissed. Grace could hear it. Then footsteps. The sound of a door opening. I should get back before she comes home, Derek said. See you Monday at the office. The recording continued for another minute of silence, then clicked off as the suite went quiet. Grace sat on Sarah's couch, tears streaming down her face, one hand on her belly. The baby kicked, strong and insistent. A reminder that this wasn't just about her anymore. We're going to the police, Sarah said firmly. Right now, Grace nodded. For the first time in months, she had hope. She had proof. Detective Morris Grant looked like everyone's favorite uncle. Salt and pepper hair, kind eyes, a patient smile that probably worked wonders during interrogations. He listened to Grace's story without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When she played the recording on her phone, he sat forward, his entire demeanor shifting. Mrs. Sullivan? He said when the audio finished. This is a serious matter. I'm going to need you to send me that recording and come in tomorrow to give a formal statement. We'll open an investigation immediately. Grace felt something loosen in her chest. You believe me. Ma'am, I have your husband on tape discussing how to murder you. Yes, I believe you. Detective Grant helped her file for an emergency restraining order. By 6 p.m. that evening, Grace had official papers barring Derek from coming within 500 feet of her. She moved into Sarah's apartment, bringing only her laptop, some clothes, and the baby monitor as evidence. That night, for the first time in 18 months, Grace slept without fear. She woke to her phone ringing at 7 a.m. Unknown number. She answered cautiously. Grace Sullivan, a woman's voice, professional and cold. Yes, this is Jennifer Walsh from Walsh and Patterson Law Firm. I represent your husband, Derek Sullivan. I'm calling to inform you that we filed an emergency motion in Travis County Family Court regarding your mental health and the safety of your unborn child. Grace sat up, her heart suddenly racing. What are you talking about? We have substantial evidence suggesting you're experiencing pregnancy-induced psychosis and pose a danger to yourself and the baby. We've requested an immediate psychiatric evaluation and temporary suspension of the restraining order you obtained under false pretenses. The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. You are welcome to retain counsel. The call ended. Grace stared at her phone, her hands shaking. Sarah appeared in the doorway. Who was that? Derek's lawyer. They're saying I'm crazy. The hearing the next morning was a nightmare. Derek's attorney, Jennifer Walsh, was a shark in Chanel. She presented a carefully constructed narrative. Grace had always been unstable, prone to paranoia, struggling with the stress of pregnancy. She'd made wild accusations before. She had a history of mental health issues. Your Honor, Walsh said smoothly, we have text messages from Mrs. Sullivan threatening self-harm. We have testimony from her therapist indicating delusional thinking. We have medical records documenting her anxiety and depression. This recording she claims to have is clearly fabricated, a product of her deteriorating mental state. Grace's court-appointed attorney, fresh out of law school and clearly overwhelmed, barely managed a defense. The judge, a tired-looking woman named Patricia Westbrook, reviewed the documents. I'm ordering a 72-hour psychiatric evaluation at Austin State Hospital. The restraining order is suspended pending the results of that evaluation. Mrs. Sullivan, you're to report to the hospital by 5 p.m. today. Your Honor, please, Grace tried to speak. Mrs. Sullivan, I understand you're frightened, but if you're experiencing a mental health crisis, you need help, not a courtroom battle. The evaluation will determine the truth. Grace felt the world tilt sideways. Derek sat at the plaintiff's table, the picture of a concerned husband. He even managed to look like he'd been crying. Outside the courthouse, Sarah grabbed Grace's arm. Don't go to that hospital. Get in your car and drive. Mexico, Canada, anywhere, I'll help you. But Grace knew running would only prove Derek's point. She reported to Austin State Hospital at 4:30 p.m., where they confiscated her phone and placed her in a psychiatric ward for evaluation. For 72 hours, doctors asked her questions designed to prove she was delusional. They asked about the recording. Grace told them about the baby monitor, the cloud storage, the exact date and time. Mrs. Sullivan, the psychiatrist said gently, we've reviewed your phone. There's no recording matching that description. Your iCloud account shows no such file. Grace's blood went cold. That's impossible. I heard it. My friend heard it. It's there. I'm afraid it's not. Later, Grace would learn that Derek had paid a tech expert $20,000 to hack her old nursing school email, delete the Apple ID, and wipe every trace of the recording from existence. The baby monitor itself sat in his office, smashed to pieces. On the third day, they released her with a diagnosis of pregnancy-induced anxiety and paranoid ideation. Not psychotic, but not entirely stable either. The restraining order remained suspended. Grace returned to Sarah's apartment to find Derek's lawyer had filed new motions. They wanted Grace to wear a GPS ankle monitor for her own safety. They wanted supervised visitation rights established immediately upon the baby's birth. They were building a case for full custody. I had proof, Grace whispered to Sarah that night. I had him on tape. We'll find another way, Sarah promised. But Grace could hear the doubt in her friend's voice. Without the recording, it was her word against Derek's. And Derek had money, lawyers, and a perfect public image. Grace had nothing but the truth. And in family court, that wasn't nearly enough. The first disaster came at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday. Grace woke to the sound of breaking glass. She sat up in Sarah's guest room, her heart hammering, her hand instinctively going to her belly. Another crash, this one from the living room. Sarah screamed. Grace grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her fingers shaking so hard she almost dropped it. She could hear footsteps, heavy and deliberate. Then Derek's voice, loud enough to carry through the walls. Where is she? Get out, Sarah shouted. I'm calling the police. Call them. I'm her husband. I have every right to see my wife. Grace crept to the bedroom door, her phone pressed to her ear. The 911 operator was asking questions she couldn't focus on. Through the crack in the door, she saw Derek standing in Sarah's destroyed living room, her laptop smashed on the floor, papers scattered everywhere. Mrs. Sullivan had a backup of that recording on this laptop. Didn't she? Derek said calmly. Can't have that floating around. Bad for business. There was no backup. You psycho, Sarah stood between him and the hallway, brave and terrified. Derek smiled. Then you won't mind if I make sure. He grabbed Sarah by the throat. Grace burst from the bedroom. Stop, Derek. Stop, please. He released Sarah, who collapsed coughing. Derek turned to Grace, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Not anger, something colder. Calculation. You're coming home, he said. The police are on their way. Good. I'll tell them I came to check on my mentally unstable wife and found her friend holding her against her will. He stepped closer. Who do you think they'll believe? Grace, the concerned husband, or the paranoid woman with a psych hold on her record? He was right. She knew he was right. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Derek straightened his jacket, smoothed his hair. When the police arrived 3 minutes later, he was the picture of concern. Officers, thank God. My wife has been staying here, and her friend has been preventing me from seeing her. I was worried about the baby's safety. The officers took statements, looked at the destroyed laptop, noted Sarah's accusations, but they also saw the suspension of the restraining order, saw Derek's calm demeanor, saw Grace's psychiatric evaluation paperwork. Mr. Sullivan, you need to leave, one officer said. This isn't your property. Of course, officer, I just wanted to make sure my wife was safe. He looked at Grace. I love you, please come home. We can work this out. After he left, the officers suggested Sarah file for a restraining order of her own. They took pictures of the damage. They wrote a report. Then they left. Grace and Sarah sat in the wreckage, both shaking. He destroyed my laptop, Sarah whispered. That was my whole life. I'm so sorry, Grace said. Sarah, I'm so sorry. The second disaster came 36 hours later. Grace woke to cramping, sharp and insistent. She was bleeding, not much, but enough to send panic racing through her. Sarah drove her to St. David's Medical Center, both of them silent with fear. In the emergency room, they hooked Grace up to monitors, checked the baby's heartbeat, ran tests. The cramping was stress-induced. The doctor said, not labor, but a warning. She needed complete bed rest, minimal stress, careful monitoring. Grace was lying in the hospital bed, the baby's heartbeat steady on the monitor. When Derek walked in, I'm her husband, he told the nurse at the station. I have the right to see her. The nurse checked the chart, saw nothing barring him from entry, and nodded. Derek pulled a chair next to Grace's bed. Up close, she could see he hadn't slept, could smell whiskey underneath his cologne. You're making this so much harder than it needs to be, he said quietly. All I wanted was for us to be a family. Why did you have to ruin it? You were going to kill me. I was talking. People talk. They say things they don't mean when they're frustrated. Derek, please, just let me go. We'll get divorced. You can see the baby. I won't fight for child support. Just let me go. He leaned forward, his hand covering hers on the bed. To anyone watching, it would have looked tender. Grace, listen very carefully. You're going to come home. You're going to be a good wife. And when the baby comes, you're going to have some complications, tragic complications. And I'm going to be devastated. Do you understand? She understood perfectly. He wasn't hiding anymore. He didn't need to. A nurse came in to check vitals. Derek immediately became the concerned husband, asking about Grace's condition, thanking the staff for their excellent care. The nurse actually blushed at his attention. After Derek left, the nurse made a note in Grace's chart, patient showing signs of paranoid thinking regarding spouse. Recommends psychiatric consultation. The third disaster came that evening. Grace's court-appointed attorney called. Derek's legal team had filed new motions. They were requesting a GPS ankle monitor be placed on Grace immediately, citing her unstable behavior and risk of flight. The judge had approved it. By 9 p.m., Grace sat on Sarah's couch with an ankle monitor locked around her leg. It would track her every movement, alert authorities if she went more than a mile from Sarah's apartment. There was no escape now. Her phone was gone, smashed by Derek, her laptop destroyed, the recording deleted. The police didn't believe her. The courts thought she was unstable. She wore a tracking device like a criminal. Grace looked down at her belly, at the baby who would be born into this nightmare, and felt something inside her break. Not her will to survive. That remained, stubborn and fierce. But her faith in the system, her belief that truth mattered, her hope that someone would help her, all of it shattered like glass. She was utterly, completely alone. Grace spent the next 2 days in a fog. She barely ate, barely spoke. Sarah tried everything she could think of, but Grace had retreated somewhere deep inside herself, somewhere even her friend couldn't reach. On the third day, Sarah's phone rang. Unknown number. Hello. Is this Sarah Reeves? A man's voice, deep and authoritative. Who's asking? My name is Colonel James Brennan, United States Army Reserve, retired. I'm trying to reach Grace Sullivan. I understand she's staying with you. Ooh, Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. How did you get this number? Ma'am, I know Grace is in trouble. I know what Derek Sullivan is planning. And I know her father, Thomas Monroe, would have wanted me to help his daughter. Sarah covered the phone's microphone and whispered to Grace, someone claiming to be a Colonel Brennan says he knew your father. Grace's head snapped up. Jim Brennan. She took the phone with trembling hands. This is Grace. Grace, you probably don't remember me. You were about 10 years old the last time I saw you. Your father and I served together in Iraq, 2003 to 2005. He saved my life during an ambush in Fallujah, took a bullet that was meant for me. I've owed him a debt for 20 years. Grace's throat tightened. Her father had died of a heart attack when she was 19. She'd grown up on his stories about the war, about the brothers he'd served with. I remember the name, she said carefully. My father talked about you. I've been following your case through some contacts at the VA. What Derek Sullivan is doing to you, what he's planning. Grace, your father would never forgive me if I didn't step in. I don't understand. Bussy, how can you help? The courts won't listen. I have no proof. He's going to kill me, and no one will stop him. I can stop him, but I need you to trust me, and I need you to be brave one more time. Jim's voice was calm, steady, the kind of voice you believed. I have a private helicopter, I have resources, and I have friends at the Austin DA's office who specialize in domestic violence cases. Real attorneys, not the overworked public defender they stuck you with. Her name is Rachel Hoffman. She's won cases like yours before. I have an ankle monitor. I can't leave. I know. That's why we're going to do this legally. Rachel is filing emergency motions right now. We're going to get you into a women's shelter in Houston. Different jurisdiction, different judges. We're going to rebuild your case from the ground up. And we're going to put Derek Sullivan in prison where he belongs. Grace closed her eyes. It sounded too good to be true. She'd learned that lesson already. Why would you do this for me? Because your father bled for me. Because I have a daughter, and if she ever needed help, I'd want someone to step up. And because men like Derek Sullivan don't get to win, not on my watch. Sarah grabbed Grace's hand, squeezing tight. What do I need to do? Grace asked. Tomorrow morning, you and Sarah are going to Sacred Heart Catholic Church on West 6th Street. It's a public place. Lots of people around. Rachel and I will meet you there at 10 a.m. We will have everything ready. Can you do that? Yes. Grace, listen to me. This is going to work. I promise you. Your father's debt will be paid. The call ended. Grace sat there, the phone still pressed to her ear, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in weeks, something that felt like hope stirred in her chest. Sarah hugged her tight. See, I told you we'd find a way. That night, Grace allowed herself to imagine a future, a small apartment somewhere safe, her baby, healthy and happy, freedom. She fell asleep with her hands on her belly, whispering to her unborn child, it's going to be okay. Someone's coming to help us. The next morning, Grace and Sarah drove to Sacred Heart Church. The ankle monitor didn't trigger any alarms. Since the church was within her allowed radius, they arrived early, sitting in the parking lot, watching for a helicopter. At exactly 10 a.m., a sleek black helicopter descended onto the church's grassy field. The rotors kicked up dust and leaves. Grace watched through the car window, her heart pounding with something that might have been hope. A man stepped out, tall, late 50s, with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in uniform. He wore jeans and a leather jacket, but moved like a soldier. Behind him, a woman in a gray suit carried a briefcase. Jim Brennan and Rachel Hoffman. Grace and Sarah got out of the car. Jim walked toward them, his hand extended. Grace Sullivan, you look just like your father. Grace shook his hand. His grip was firm, reassuring. Rachel stepped forward. Mrs. Sullivan, I've reviewed your case. What's been done to you is unconscionable. We're going to fix it. They walked into the church's community center, where Rachel spread out documents on a table, emergency custody petition, motion to dissolve the ankle monitor, Application for a shelter placement under the Violence Against Women Act. This is going to move fast, Rachel explained. We have a sympathetic judge in Houston who specializes in DV cases. Once we get you across county lines, we'll file everything there. New jurisdiction means a fresh start. What about Derek? Grace asked. We're going to build a case he can't escape from. Financial records, medical documentation, witness testimony. We'll find a way to recover that recording, even if we have to subpoena the cloud service directly. And we'll make sure the world knows what he is. Grace felt Sarah's hand in hers, felt the baby kick against her ribs. She looked at Jim, at this man who'd flown across Texas to help a stranger because of a 20-year-old debt. Thank you, she whispered. Jim smiled. Thank your father. He's the hero here. I'm just keeping a promise. They finalized the plan. Tomorrow, Jim would fly Grace to Houston. Rachel would have everything ready. Grace would be safe. For the first time in months, Grace allowed herself to believe it. She had no idea that in 36 hours, that belief would nearly kill her. The helicopter lifted off from Sacred Heart Church at 8 a.m. the next morning. Grace sat in the back seat, her hands gripping the safety harness, watching Austin grow smaller below her. The city sprawled out in all directions, a patchwork of highways and neighborhoods, and the glittering curve of Lady Bird Lake cutting through the center like a silver ribbon. Sarah had wanted to come, but there wasn't room. They'd said tearful goodbyes in the parking lot, promising to talk as soon as Grace was settled. Thank you for this, Grace had whispered, hugging her friend tight. For everything. Just be safe, Sarah had replied, her voice breaking. Call me the second you land. Now, thousands of feet above the ground, Grace watched her friend's figure disappear into nothing, the last tether to her old life, growing smaller and smaller until it was gone. Jim Brennan piloted with easy confidence, the kind that came from thousands of flight hours. His hands moved over the controls with practiced efficiency, adjusting altitude and trajectory like it was second nature. He'd brought coffee and breakfast tacos from Torchy's, still warm in their foil wrapping, which Grace couldn't bring herself to eat. Her stomach was in knots. But for once, it wasn't from fear. It was anticipation. Hope. That dangerous thing she'd almost forgotten how to feel. They flew south over the hill country, following Highway 35 toward Houston. The landscape below was beautiful in that stark Texas way. Rolling green hills dotted with live oaks and cedar. Winding rivers that carved through limestone. Ranches with tiny houses that looked like toys from this height. Grace watched it all, thinking about the future. A shelter, a new lawyer, a real chance at freedom, maybe even happiness. Though that seemed almost too much to hope for. The baby kicked, a strong jab against her ribs. Grace pressed her hand to the spot, smiling despite everything. We're going to make it, she whispered. I promise. Jim glanced back at her through the cockpit mirror, his expression unreadable behind his aviator sunglasses. You doing okay back there? Not airsick or anything? I'm fine, Grace said. Just ready to land. Won't be long now. Houston's about 45 minutes out. Grace allowed herself to relax slightly, leaning her head against the window. Below, a cattle ranch spread out across hundreds of acres. She could see the tiny figures of cows grazing, a red barn, a farmhouse with a wraparound porch. It looked peaceful, safe, like the kind of place where bad things didn't happen. Jim's phone rang. He answered through the helicopter's Bluetooth system, his voice filling the cabin. Yeah, I've got her, he said casually, like he was confirming a package delivery. Don't worry, Derek. She'll never make it to Houston. The words took a moment to register. Grace's brain tried to reject them, tried to find some other meaning, some explanation that made sense. Maybe he was talking about someone else. Maybe she'd misheard. But then Jim glanced back at her again, and she saw something in his eyes that made her blood turn to ice. What? Grace whispered, though she already knew. Some part of her had always known. The rescue had been too perfect, too convenient. Hope was always a trap. Jim sighed, adjusting his headset. Sorry, Grace. I know this isn't what you were hoping to hear. You work for Derek. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears, distant and hollow. I work for money. Derek offered me $500,000 to intercept you and make sure you had an unfortunate accident. It's more than any debt I owed your father. Jim adjusted the controls, banking the helicopter toward the west, away from Houston. The landscape below shifted, became more desolate. For what it's worth, I did serve with Thomas. Good man, saved my life in Fallujah. But he's dead, and you're the one with the problem. Grace's mind raced, cycling through possibilities and finding nothing but dead ends. She was 2,000 feet in the air with a man who'd just admitted he was going to kill her. The door was locked from the pilot's controls. There was nowhere to run, no one to call for help. Her phone was in her purse, but even if she could reach it, what would she say? Where would she tell them to come? You can't do this, she said, trying to keep her voice steady, trying to sound braver than she felt. People know I'm with you. Sarah knows. Rachel Hoffman knows. Jim laughed, a sound without humor. Rachel Hoffman doesn't exist. Or rather, she does. But she's Derek's personal attorney's niece, fresh out of law school and happy to make 10 grand for playing a part. Nice girl, actually. Good actress. The documents she showed you yesterday, fake. The Houston judge made up. The whole thing was theater. Grace. Derek's specialty. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow. She'd believed Rachel, had trusted her, had allowed herself to hope that someone was finally fighting for her. But it had all been Derek, pulling strings, manipulating her even from a distance. Even when she thought she was escaping, she'd been walking deeper into his trap. The helicopter, Grace said desperately, grasping at straws. Someone will track it. The FAA, flight records. I filed a flight plan to Houston. We're going to have a terrible accident over Lady Bird Lake. Mechanical failure. Happens more than you'd think with these older models. Tragic loss of life. Your body might not even be recovered. Jim's tone was conversational, almost apologetic, like he was explaining why he couldn't make it to a dinner party. Derek's already drafted the press release. Grieving husband, devastated by the loss of his beloved wife and unborn child. He'll probably set up a foundation in your name, make a big donation to domestic violence charities. Very touching. Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Wouldn't let Derek win even this small victory of breaking her spirit before he broke her body. My father would be ashamed of you, she said quietly. For just a moment, something flickered across Jim's face. Regret, maybe, or guilt, but it passed quickly, replaced by cold pragmatism. Your father's dead. Grace, debt doesn't mean much when you're buried 6 feet under. And I've got a daughter of my own to think about. College tuition, wedding someday, 500 grand goes a long way. The helicopter descended, heading toward Lady Bird Lake. The water glittered below them, deceptively beautiful in the morning sun. Grace could see kayakers, joggers on the trail, people living their normal lives, completely unaware that someone was about to die right above their heads. Grace's hands moved to her seatbelt, her fingers finding the release mechanism. If she could get it off, if she could somehow fight him, maybe she had a chance. But Jim saw the movement in his mirror. Don't bother, he said, his voice hardening. You're 8 months pregnant. Grace, even if you overpower me, which you won't, this helicopter crashes and we both die. Just accept it. Close your eyes. I'll make it quick. You won't even feel the impact. The helicopter descended lower, maybe 300 feet above the lake now. Grace could see the ripples on the water's surface, could make out individual trees on the shore. Her mind kept cycling through the same impossible equation, how to survive the unsurvivable. Then she thought about her father, about the debt Jim claimed he owed, about the kind of man her father had been, the values he'd tried to instill in her. Courage, he'd always said, not the absence of fear, but acting despite it. And she thought about the emergency locator beacon she'd read about in the helicopter safety card when she first boarded, barely paying attention, just nervous energy, looking for distraction. The bright orange handle mounted near her seat, labeled EPIRB, emergency position indicating radio beacon. If she was going to die, she'd make damn sure someone knew why. Grace grabbed the fire extinguisher mounted between the seats and swung it with all her strength at Jim's head. The impact wasn't enough to knock him out, but it was enough to make him lose control. The helicopter lurched violently to the left, the nose dipping suddenly. Jim shouted, grabbing for the controls with one hand and swatting at Grace with the other. She pulled the EPIRB handle. The beacon activated with a loud electronic squeal, broadcasting their position to every emergency service within range. The sound filled the cabin, shrill and insistent. "You stupid," Jim snarled. But Grace wasn't listening. She yanked open the door. 2,000 feet had become 300. 300 had become 200. Not survivable at terminal velocity, barely survivable even now. But the alternative was certain death, and Grace Sullivan had decided she wasn't ready to die. She looked at her belly one last time, at the baby who deserved a chance at life, and jumped. The cold water hit her like a wall of concrete. She plunged deep, the impact stunning her, knocking the air from her lungs. For a moment, she thought she'd made a terrible mistake, thought the shock alone would kill her. Then her survival instincts kicked in. She kicked toward the surface, her wet clothes dragging her down, her pregnant belly making every movement harder. She broke through with a gasp, gulping air, her lungs burning. Above her, the helicopter circled once. Jim stared down at her, his expression one of pure disbelief. Then he banked away, disappearing over the trees. He couldn't stay. Not with the EPIRB broadcasting and emergency services already responding. Grace swam toward shore, each stroke agony, her wet clothes dragging her down. The baby kicked frantically, as if understanding the danger, as if fighting alongside her. She focused on that feeling, on the life inside her refusing to give up. Her feet finally touched the muddy bottom. She crawled onto the shore near Auditorium Shores, collapsing in the grass, water streaming from her clothes. People were already running toward her, attracted by the sight of the helicopter and the woman who jumped from it. A jogger reached her first, dropping to his knees beside her. "Oh my God, are you okay? What happened?" Grace tried to speak, but all that came out was a sob. She lay there in the mud, water streaming from her clothes, her baby still kicking, and realized something profound. She was alive, against all odds. Despite Derek's money and Jim's betrayal and the system's failures, she was alive, and she was done running. The jogger who found Grace wasn't just any jogger. His name was Todd Fisher, and he was an investigative reporter for KXAN News. He'd been researching corruption in Austin real estate for months, following leads on developers who bribed city officials and laundered money through shell companies. Derek Sullivan's name was already on his radar. When Todd saw a pregnant woman crawl out of Lady Bird Lake, saw the helicopter circling overhead, he didn't just call 911. He filmed everything on his phone and called his attorney contact. That contact was the real Rachel Hoffman. By the time the ambulance arrived, Grace was surrounded by EMTs, police officers, and one very determined reporter. She told them everything, the words tumbling out between gasps for air. Derek, Jim, the fake rescue, the attempted murder. "She's in shock," one of the officers said. "We need to get her to the hospital." But Todd stopped them. "Wait, play that back." He showed them his phone footage, the helicopter circling, Grace jumping, and crucially, the EPIRB signal timestamp that would prove when and where the emergency beacon was activated. "This woman isn't crazy," Todd said. "Someone just tried to kill her." At St. David's Medical Center, Grace was checked from head to toe. Miraculously, the baby was fine. Grace had some bruising, mild hypothermia, and was lucky to be alive. But there was no permanent damage. While she recovered in the emergency room, Todd made calls. Within 2 hours, the real Rachel Hoffman arrived with a file box full of documents. "Mrs. Sullivan," Rachel said, sitting beside Grace's hospital bed. "I'm the actual victim's rights attorney," Todd called. "I've been looking into your case since yesterday when a woman claiming to be me called to ask questions about shelter placements. That's not how I work, so I started digging." She opened the file box. Inside were financial records, property deeds, and bank statements. "Derek Sullivan has been laundering money through fake real estate deals for 3 years. I have proof of fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. Your case just gave me the final piece: attempted murder for financial gain. We've got him." Grace stared at the documents, her mind trying to process. "The recording, he deleted it. We don't need the recording anymore," Rachel said. "Jim Brennan was taken into custody 20 minutes ago. His helicopter's EPIRB signal led police right to him. He's already started talking." trying to cut a deal. He admitted Derek hired him. He's giving us bank transfers, text messages, everything. Derek will have an excuse, he always does. Todd stepped forward. Not this time. I've been investigating him for months. With Jim's testimony and these financial records, we have enough to get a warrant. The DA's office is moving right now. Grace closed her eyes. She'd been fighting for so long, it was hard to believe someone else was finally fighting with her. What happens now, she asked. Now, Rachel said, we hold a press conference, we tell your story, and we make sure everyone knows what Derek Sullivan really is. The next morning, Grace stood on the steps of the Travis County Courthouse. Behind her stood Rachel, Todd, Detective Grant, and a representative from the DA's office. Cameras from every news station in Austin pointed at her. Grace wore a simple navy dress borrowed from Rachel. Her hair was still damp from the lake. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who'd survived hell and lived to tell about it. My name is Grace Sullivan, she began. 3 days ago, my husband tried to have me killed for $12 million. She told them everything. The recording, the fake rescue, Jim Brennan's betrayal, the jump into Lady Bird Lake. Every word was broadcast live, streamed across social media, shared thousands of times within minutes. When she finished, the questions came in a flood. Mrs. Sullivan, are you afraid Derek will retaliate? Grace looked directly into the camera. I'm not afraid of Derek anymore. I'm angry, and I'm going to make sure every woman in his position knows that the system can work. It's slow, it's imperfect, but it can work if you fight hard enough. Behind her, Detective Grant stepped forward. Derek Sullivan was arrested this morning at his office. He's been charged with conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, domestic violence, fraud, and racketeering. Bail has been denied. Jim Brennan is also in custody and cooperating with prosecutors. The crowd erupted. Cameras flashed. Grace felt Rachel's hand on her shoulder, steady and sure. That afternoon, sitting in a conference room at the DA's office, Grace finally allowed herself to break down. Rachel held her while she cried, months of terror and rage and grief pouring out. You did it, Rachel said quietly. You survived. I never wanted to be a survivor, Grace whispered. I just wanted to be happy. You will be. But first, we finish this. The trial took 3 months. The evidence was overwhelming. Jim Brennan testified about Derek's plan in excruciating detail. Todd Fisher's financial investigation revealed millions in stolen funds. Medical experts confirmed Grace's injuries were consistent with long-term abuse. Derek's lawyers tried every trick. They claimed Grace had made everything up. They suggested she'd staged the helicopter incident herself. They painted her as unstable, vindictive, desperate. The jury didn't buy it. On a warm afternoon in October, Judge Patricia Westbrook read the verdict. On the count of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty. On the count of attempted murder, guilty. On all remaining counts, guilty. Young Derek Sullivan would spend 45 years to life in prison. Grace sat in the courtroom, her daughter Emma sleeping in her arms. The baby had been born 2 weeks after Derek's arrest, healthy and perfect. She had Grace's eyes and, thankfully, none of Derek's darkness. Outside the courthouse, Grace gave one final interview. What do you want people to know? Todd asked. Grace looked at her daughter, then at the camera. I want them to know that leaving is the most dangerous thing you'll ever do. The system will fail you. People you trust will betray you. You'll think you can't survive, but you can. You find one person who believes you. You document everything. You fight like hell, and you never ever give up. 6 months after the verdict, Grace stood in front of a brick building in East Austin. The sign above the door read Sullivan House in simple letters. It was smaller than she'd imagined when she first conceived of the shelter, but it was real. The $12 million trust fund from her father had finally been released. Grace had used $2 million to buy and renovate this building. The rest went into an endowment that would keep Sullivan House running for decades. You ready? Rachel asked beside her. Rachel had left her law firm to become Sullivan House's executive director, coordinating legal services for the women who would stay here. I'm ready. They opened the doors together. Inside, the shelter had 12 beds, a communal kitchen, a playroom for children, and offices for counselors and attorneys. It smelled like fresh paint and possibility. The first resident arrived that afternoon. Her name was Michelle. She was 26, pregnant, with a black eye and a restraining order that her husband had already violated twice. She stood in the doorway, holding a garbage bag that contained everything she owned. "Is this real?" Michelle asked, her voice breaking. "Is it safe?" Grace took her hand. "It's real. And you're safe now. I promise." Over the next weeks, more women came. Some stayed for days, others for months. Grace met with each one, sharing her story when it helped, listening when that was what they needed. She learned that her pain had purpose, that surviving wasn't just about living through something terrible. It was about using that experience to help others survive too. Todd Fisher did a documentary about Sullivan House. It aired on PBS and won awards. The publicity brought in donations, volunteers, and attention from legislators who passed new laws protecting domestic violence victims. Jim Brennan, serving 15 years for his role in the conspiracy, sent Grace a letter from prison. She never opened it. Some debts could never be repaid. Derek Sullivan appealed his conviction twice. Both appeals were denied. In prison, he tried to maintain his reputation as a successful businessman, telling anyone who'd listen that his wife had framed him. No one believed him anymore. One afternoon in early summer, Grace sat on the front porch of Sullivan House, watching Emma toddle across the grass. The baby was walking now, laughing at everything, completely unaware of the darkness she'd been born into. Sarah visited that day, bringing lunch and updates. She'd started a tech repair business, teaching other women how to recover deleted files and protect their digital privacy. Her own laptop, destroyed by Derek, had become evidence that helped convict him. "Do you ever regret not running?" Sarah asked. "When things were at their worst, you could have just disappeared." Grace thought about it. "Every day. But if I'd run, he would have hunted me forever. This way, I took my life back. I didn't just escape. I won." A car pulled up. A woman got out, nervous and scared, holding a small boy's hand. Grace recognized that look. She'd worn it herself not so long ago. Grace stood. Emma balanced on her hip and walked toward the woman. "Welcome to Sullivan House," she said. "You're safe now." The woman started crying. Grace hugged her, one arm around the stranger, one holding her daughter. Behind them, the shelter doors stood open, ready to receive another survivor. That evening, after the new resident was settled and Emma was asleep, Grace did something she hadn't done in months. She visited the prison. Derek sat across from her in the visiting room, looking older than his 35 years. Prison hadn't been kind to him. His expensive suits were gone, replaced by orange scrubs. His arrogance had faded into something bitter and defensive. "You came," he said, surprised. "I came to tell you something." Grace said, "I forgive you." Derek's expression flickered. "You what?" "I forgive you, say, not for you, yeah. For me, I'm not carrying your poison anymore. I survived what you did to me. I built something good from the worst experience of my life. You took 18 months from me, Derek, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life making those months matter." She stood to leave. "Grace, wait." Derek's voice was desperate now. "I'm sorry. I know I can't fix what I did. But I'm sorry. I was wrong. I was sick. You were a man who chose to hurt people weaker than you. That's all. No excuses, no explanations. Just a choice you made, over and over." Grace looked at him one last time. "I hope prison changes you. I hope you find some kind of peace. But I'm done carrying the weight of your choices." She walked out of the visiting room, out of the prison, into the warm Texas evening. The helicopter sound that had once terrified her was just background noise now. She'd learned that rescue doesn't come from the skitum, it comes from within. Grace drove home to her small apartment, where Emma waited with the babysitter. She picked up her daughter, breathed in the smell of baby shampoo and innocence, and whispered what she told herself every night. "You're safe. We're safe, and we're going to be okay." Behind her, the city lights of Austin glittered like stars. Somewhere in those lights were women who needed help, women who were trapped like she'd been, women who didn't know if they could survive. But they would. Grace would make sure of it, one survivor at a time.